The Siege of Terra ended in silence. Not the silence of death, but something far more terrible. The silence of completion, of finality. Of a dream achieved so perfectly that it consumed the dreamer and the dream alike. When the Emperor's power-wreathed fist punched through Horus's chest plate and ripped out the War Master's treacherous heart, reality itself shuddered and rewrote its fundamental laws. The Chaos Gods screamed as their greatest champion died not in glorious battle, but in absolute erasure. Every atom of Horus Lupercal ceased to exist across all timelines, all possibilities, all echoes in the warp. The victory was so complete that even memory struggled to hold his image. This was the moment everything changed. This was the moment the Emperor won. And 10,000 years later, as the last human dies alone on a forgotten world, we finally understand what that victory cost. The Golden Throne stands empty in this timeline. Its mechanisms gather dust in the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, a relic of a crisis that never came to pass. The Emperor walks the halls of Terra with measured steps, his physical form radiating a cold perfection that makes even the Adeptus Custodes avert their eyes. He survived the heresy intact, his body unmarred by the wounds that should have killed him. Malcador the Sigillite still fell, of course. Someone had to hold the wards while the Emperor confronted his wayward son. But the regent's sacrifice was not in vain. When the Emperor returned from the vengeful spirit, he returned whole and changed. Something in that final confrontation with Horus had transformed him beyond mortal comprehension. Perhaps it was the act of unmaking his most beloved son. Perhaps it was the strain of reaching into the warp and strangling the very concept of corruption at its source. Whatever the truth, the Emperor who emerged from that battle was no longer the man who had begun the Great Crusade. He was something older, colder, more. The traitor legions ceased to exist within a solar decade, not fled to the Eye of Terror, not banished to wage endless war from the warp, seized. The Emperor pursued them with the methodical precision of a surgeon excising cancer. He appeared on daemon worlds and burned them clean with psychic fire that left nothing behind but sterile rock. He followed fleeing ships through the warp itself, his consciousness a blade that cut through the immaterium like adamantium through flesh. Fulgrim died screaming his god's name, only to realize mid-cry that Slanesh could no longer hear him. Angron fell in battle against his father. The butcher's nails finally silent, as the Emperor's will severed every connection between the ruinous powers and the materium. Mortarion withered, Magnus shattered. Perturabo simply stopped, his last words a mathematical equation proving the futility of resistance. One by one, the traitors fell. One by one, the daemons learned to fear the Emperor's terrible purpose. And, one by one, the gods themselves began to understand that something had changed in the great game. The warp began to die, not quickly, but inevitably. Like a fire starved of oxygen, the immaterium started to contract, to fade, to lose the wild chaos that had defined it since sentient life first felt emotion. The Emperor had learned the secret during his final confrontation with Horus. He had seen how the Chaos Gods fed on belief, on passion, on the raw screaming emotion of mortal souls. And he had understood, with terrible clarity, how to kill them, not through force, not through psychic might, through starvation, through the systematic elimination of everything that gave the warp its power: faith, hope, rage, love, ambition, fear. All the colors of the human experience that made the immaterium burn with impossible energy. If those could be excised from humanity, if mankind could be elevated beyond such primitive drives, the Chaos Gods would simply fade into nothingness. It was perfect logic. It was the imperial truth taken to its ultimate conclusion. It was genocide on a level that made the Horus heresy look like a skirmish. Terra became the center of the Emperor's grand experiment. The billions who called the throne world home found themselves subject to a systematic restructuring of society that began in the mind and ended in the soul. The ecclesiarchy was never allowed to form. The worship of the Emperor was punished with the same severity as any other superstition. Religious iconography was stripped from every structure, every data slate, every scrap of parchment. The imperial Aquila remained, but only as a symbol of political authority, never divine power. Children were raised in education facilities that taught pure rationality from birth. Emotion was not forbidden precisely, but it was discouraged, tempered, controlled, until it became more of a theoretical concept than a lived experience. The population learned to speak in measured tones, to move with calculated efficiency, to think only thoughts that served the emperor's vision of an enlightened humanity. Those who could not adapt were not executed. Execution would be crude. They were simply removed to facilities where they could be studied, their aberrant psychology catalogued and counted in future generations. The Adeptus Astartes presented a unique problem. These warriors were bred for passion. Their gene seed carried the emotional intensity of their primarchs, distilled and amplified through psycho-conditioning and combat drugs. The Space Marines were walking contradictions to everything the Emperor now sought to achieve. He could not simply unmake them. They were his finest weapons, and the galaxy was not yet secure. Instead, he began a process of systematic transformation that would take millennia to complete. New chapters were founded with gene seed that had been carefully edited, stripped of the emotional markers that made the Astartes so dangerous. The older chapters found their recruitment slowing, their numbers dwindling through attrition. When a Space Marine fell in battle, his gene seed was not always recovered. When a chapter master questioned this new doctrine, he was quietly replaced. The transformation was so gradual that few noticed until it was complete. By the year 5000, the last of the old Astartes had fallen. The new chapters that replaced them were perfect soldiers. They felt no brotherhood, no rage, no pride in their chapter's history. They simply served. The Mechanicus of Mars proved unexpectedly cooperative. The Fabricator General saw in the Emperor's vision an echo of the machine god's own perfection. Flesh was weak because it felt. The machine was pure because it calculated. If humanity could be guided toward a state of mechanical rationality, perhaps the division between man and machine would finally dissolve. The tech priests threw themselves into the Emperor's project with fervor that looked almost religious until you examined it closely and realized it was nothing more than optimized resource allocation. They developed new servitor templates that preserved cognitive function while eliminating emotional response. They created drugs that suppressed the mammalian brain's limbic system without causing lasting damage. They designed education programs so effective that children who completed them could recite the principles of logic before they learned their own names. Mars became a factory of compliance, churning out the tools needed to rebuild humanity according to the Emperor's specifications. The warp grew quieter. Year by year, century by century, the Imperium lost its fury. The tides that had once raged through that impossible space began to still. The daemons found themselves weakened, their forms less solid, their power less absolute. The chaos gods themselves felt the change like a slow starvation. Khorne's rage found fewer and fewer mortals to fuel his endless hunger. Tzientch's schemes collapsed as humanity learned to think in predictable, rational patterns. Nurgle's plagues lost their emotional weight when people no longer feared death. Slanesh, youngest of the four, suffered most of all. How could excess exist when humanity had learned perfect moderation? The gods did not die, not yet, but they diminished. They became shadows of their former terrible glory, and the Emperor watched their decline with cold satisfaction, his mind already calculating the point at which they would finally collapse into nothingness. Psykers stopped being born. The change was so gradual that it took 3,000 years to recognize the pattern. At first, it seemed like a statistical anomaly. Fewer children manifested psychic powers during adolescence. Fewer astropaths were trained. Fewer navigators emerged from the great houses. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica scrambled to adjust their recruitment quotas, assuming this was a temporary fluctuation. But the numbers kept declining. By 7,000, Psyker births had dropped to 1% of historical averages. By 8,000, they had effectively ceased. The last navigator died at age 600, her warp eye finally closing after centuries of service. No replacement emerged. The great navigator houses withered, their carefully preserved gene lines producing nothing but baseline humans. The black ships made their final voyage in 8,341, their holds empty, their purpose obsolete. And still the Emperor showed no concern. If anything, he seemed pleased. Psykers were humanity's link to the warp. If that link could be severed, if mankind could evolve beyond the need for such dangerous mutations, the victory over chaos would be absolute. The Astronomicon failed in 8,723. The great psychic beacon that had guided ships through the warp for 8 millennia simply went dark. Not catastrophically, not in a blaze of ruinous power, but gently, peacefully. The choir of Psykers who powered the beacon had dwindled to nothing. The mechanisms designed to amplify their psychic scream had no signal to amplify. Terra's light went out, and the Imperium barely noticed. They no longer needed it. The warp had grown so calm, so still, that ships could navigate it using conventional instruments. Captains who had spent their careers relying on navigators to steer through the Imperium's chaos found themselves plotting courses through empty space. The warp had become predictable. It had become safe. It had become dead. Travel between stars took longer now, true. Ships moved at sublight speeds more often, using the warp only for carefully calculated jumps between known routes. But this was acceptable. Safety was worth the loss of speed. Control was worth the cost of convenience. The Emperor's grand vision was nearly complete. Humanity forgot how to dream. The process was so subtle that no single generation noticed the loss. Parents who had vague memories of nighttime fantasies raised children who experienced only darkness during sleep. Those children grew into adults who viewed the old stories of dreams and visions as primitive superstition. The very concept of unconscious imagination began to fade from human psychology. Artists found themselves unable to create anything truly novel. They could combine existing elements, rearrange known patterns, but genuine creativity required a spark of chaos that humanity had systematically bred away. Music became mathematical. Literature became technical. Painting became geometric. The great works of the past were preserved in museums, their beauty acknowledged through rational analysis, but no one could replicate the passion that had created them. No one could understand why anyone would want to. This was progress. This was enlightenment. This was the death of the soul wearing the mask of evolution. The galaxy grew silent. Not just the warp, but reality itself seemed to hush. Orc populations crashed as the green-skinned psychic gestalt field found fewer and fewer minds to sustain it. Without the raw belief that powered their impossible technology, the orcs regressed to savage primitives armed with clubs and stones. The Eldari watched humanity's transformation with mounting horror, recognizing the pattern. They had seen this before. They had been this before. An empire so advanced, so powerful, so certain of its superiority, that it had forgotten the cost of existence. The craft world sent emissaries to Terra, desperate to warn the Emperor that he was making the same mistakes that had birthed Slaanesh. The Emperor received them with polite attention, listened to their warnings with perfect comprehension, and then had them escorted from his palace. He understood their concern. He simply did not share it. The Eldari had fallen because they had embraced excess. Humanity would survive by embracing nothing. The Necrons woke to a galaxy transformed beyond their ancient understanding. These deathless machines had slept through millions of years, waiting for a cosmos that would tremble at their return. Instead, they found an Imperium that barely acknowledged their existence. Human forces fought them with mechanical precision, losing battles through calculated sacrifice, winning wars through resource management. There was no fear in these warriors, no hatred, no recognition that the Necrons represented anything more than a logistical problem requiring systematic solution. The ancient Pharaons found themselves confused. Victory had no meaning when the enemy refused to grant it significance. The Necrons had traded their souls for immortality, and now they faced an empire that had achieved something similar without even realizing the transaction. Some dynasties returned to their tomb worlds and slept again, waiting for an age when emotion might return to the galaxy. Others continued their campaigns, but their hearts, their living, Beating hearts long turned to cold machinery were not in the fight. The Tyranids never came. In the original timeline, the Hive fleets had been drawn toward the galaxy by the psychic scream of the Astronomicon, that great lighthouse in the warp that announced humanity's presence across impossible distances. But in this reality, the beacon had gone dark before the Tyranids reached the edge of known space. The hive mind, that vast and terrible intelligence, turned its attention elsewhere. Perhaps it sensed that this galaxy offered nothing to consume. Perhaps it simply could not detect a prey species that had grown so cold, so empty, so much like the void itself. The Imperium never knew how close they had come to extinction. They never understood that in saving themselves from chaos, they had also saved themselves from the Great Devourer, a threat they would never face, a war they would never need to fight, another victory achieved through absence. The Emperor walked his palace corridors in year 9847 and found them empty. Not physically empty. Millions of servants still maintained the structure. Custodians still guarded every gate. Administrators still managed the Imperium's endless bureaucracy. But there was no life in these activities, no purpose beyond the continuation of function. The palace had become a machine made of flesh, running programs written 10,000 years earlier, calculating outputs that no longer served any meaningful goal. The Emperor paused in the Hall of Victories, a vast space lined with statues commemorating the Great Crusade's greatest triumphs. Primarchs frozen in marble, battles captured in gold. Moments of passion and fury and brotherhood preserved for eternity. He studied Sanguinius's face, carved with such skill that you could almost see the angel weeping. He examined Guilliman's stern features, the avenging son's expression captured mid-speech, forever proclaiming the virtues of the Codex Astartes. These were memories of a time when humanity had been alive, when his sons had been real, when the dream had meant something beyond mere survival. The first dreamers appeared in 9901. They were children, mostly, born on colony worlds so remote that the Emperor's systematic restructuring had reached them late, had not quite completed its work before the capacity for emotion was fully bred away. These children woke screaming from nightmares. They reported visions of impossible colors. They spoke in babbling voices about places that did not exist, creatures that had never been, stories that defied rational analysis. Their parents brought them to medical facilities, certain that some biological malfunction had occurred. The Medicae examined them thoroughly, finding nothing wrong with their physiology. Brain scans showed unusual activity in regions associated with imagination and emotional processing, regions that should have been dormant in modern humans. The children were labeled as genetic throwbacks, evolutionary dead ends that had somehow escaped quality control. They were scheduled for corrective therapy. They were supposed to be fixed, but they could not be fixed. The more the Medicae tried to suppress their dreaming, the worse it became. The children developed new symptoms. They started drawing, creating, making things that served no practical purpose. One girl on a mining world began painting murals on the walls of her HAB unit, images of gardens that had never existed, flowers in colors that defied description. A boy on an agricultural planet wrote poetry, terrible amateur verses that nonetheless carried emotional weight that made adults physically uncomfortable. On Terra itself, a child stood in the middle of a transit station and sang. Not recited, not performed, sang. Her voice carried notes that seemed impossible for a human throat to produce, and for the first time in 8,000 years, people in the Throne World capital stopped their efficient movements and stood still, listening, feeling something that they had no words to describe, something that tasted like salt and smelled like rain and burned in their chests, like swallowed stars. The Emperor ordered their termination. The decree went out on official channels, encoded in the dry language of genetic compliance protocols. Subjects exhibiting aberrant psychological patterns inconsistent with established human baseline parameters were to be located and eliminated. The dreamers represented a threat to everything he had built. They were cracks in the foundation. They were chaos creeping back into order. They were the beginning of regression toward the primal state that had made humanity vulnerable to the warp's corruption. They had to be removed. The Adeptus Arbites moved to comply, their forces deploying across thousands of worlds to locate and neutralize the targets. It should have been simple. It should have been clean. But something unexpected happened. Something that the Emperor's perfect calculations had not anticipated. The Dreamers spread their infection, not through biology, not through contagion. Through exposure. Adults who spent time near the dreaming children began experiencing strange symptoms. They found themselves pausing during work to stare at nothing. They reported intrusive thoughts of unnecessary beauty. They made mistakes, tiny inefficiencies in their routines that served no purpose except to introduce variation. The infection spread through simple contact, through conversation, through the act of witnessing someone else experience genuine emotion. On a Forge world where 3 Dreamers had been identified, productivity dropped by 0.3% after their termination. 0.3% across billions of workers. Billions of moments where hands hesitated, where minds wandered, where the machine of perfect humanity stuttered. The Mechanicus analyzed the deviation and could find no material cause. The workers claimed to feel nothing unusual. They simply found themselves thinking about the children, wondering what the dreams had contained. Curious, perhaps, about things that served no function. The Arbites could not kill them fast enough. For every dreamer terminated, 2 more emerged. Then 5, then 12. The progression was exponential. Children waking across the Imperium, their minds suddenly alive with visions that pulled against the careful conditioning of their upbringing. Adults experiencing the first stirrings of genuine emotion in their bloodlines for 100 generations. Artists appearing from nowhere, creating works that made people stop and stare and feel things they had no names for. The infection accelerated. A poet on Necromunda wrote verses about darkness and light, about the beauty of pollution and the glory of decay, and the Underhive gangs who read his words found themselves weeping. A sculptor on Ultramar carved a statue of Robute Guilliman that captured not the Primarch's strategic genius but his loneliness, his burden, his terrible humanity beneath the genetic engineering. Pilgrims traveled across the sector to see it. They claimed it made them, and remember something they had never known. The Emperor stood in his throne room and felt the galaxy shifting. His consciousness, vast enough to encompass entire star systems, detected the change, like a physician noting the first fever in a patient. Humanity was waking up. After 10,000 years of carefully induced sleep, the species was beginning to dream again. He could sense it in the warp, that supposedly dead realm beginning to stir with the faintest whisper of emotion. Not the screaming chaos of the old days, not the raw, passionate fury that had fed the ruinous powers. Something quieter, gentler, more dangerous in its subtlety. The Dreamers were not corrupted by daemons. They were not touched by the gods. They were simply human in a way that humanity had not been for centuries. And that simple humanity was unraveling everything he had built. The Emperor called his closest advisors, those few individuals who still retained enough personality to offer genuine counsel. The custodians came, the ancient mechanisms of government, the representatives of Mars. They assembled in silence, waiting for his words with perfect attention. When he spoke, his voice carried no emotion, but underneath the carefully controlled tones, something like desperation leaked through. He told them that he had made an error, not in his grand vision, not in the systematic elimination of chaos from human psychology, but in his assumption that the species could survive such transformation. He had believed that removing emotion would elevate humanity beyond the need for such primitive drives. Instead, he had discovered that emotion was not a flaw to be corrected. It was the engine of existence. Without it, humanity had no reason to continue. They performed their functions because that was what they had been programmed to do. But the programming was running down. The machine was breaking. And the Dreamers represented not corruption returning, but life, trying desperately to reassert itself before the species expired from pure efficiency. But it was too late to stop the process. The Emperor's grand vision had transformed humanity too completely. The majority of the species could not dream, could not feel, could not remember what it meant to be truly alive. They went through their routines with mechanical precision, barely noticing as their worlds began to fail. Infrastructure crumbled because no one cared enough to maintain it beyond minimum specifications. Ships launched with skeleton crews that performed their duties and then sat in silence, having nothing to say to one another. Colonies reported population declines as citizens simply stopped reproducing, the biological imperative insufficient to overcome their fundamental lack of desire for anything. The Imperium was dying, not through war, not through disaster, through apathy, through the complete success of the Emperor's plan to eliminate chaos from the human heart. The Dreamers fought desperately to reverse the decay. They traveled from world to world, trying to wake the sleeping masses, trying to teach people how to feel again. Some succeeded. Small communities began experiencing genuine emotion for the first time in their existence. They cried, they laughed, they created art that served no purpose except to express the joy of being alive. But for each community that woke, 10 more simply continued their decline. The conditioning ran too deep. The genetic modifications were too thorough. Humanity had been rebuilt into something that could not chaos, and in the process, it had been rebuilt into something that could not live. The Dreamers wept for their species, their tears falling on faces that could no longer remember how to weep in return. The warp stirred for the first time in millennia. The Dreamers' emotions, raw and pure and desperate, began to seep into the Imperium. The realm that had been so carefully starved of sustenance felt that tiny trickle of feeling and surged toward it, like a dying man reaching for water. But the warp was no longer the howling chaos it had been. The chaos gods were gone, starved into dissolution centuries earlier. What remained was something stranger, something that had never existed before. The Imperium without consciousness, potential without purpose, a realm of pure possibility waiting for something to give it shape. The Dreamers' emotions poured into that emptiness, and the warp began to change, not into daemons, not into corruption, into something that resembled hope. The Emperor felt the change and understood, finally, what he had done. He had killed the Chaos Gods. He had saved humanity from demonic corruption. He had achieved his vision of a rational, enlightened species, free from superstition and excess. And in doing so, he had killed everything that made humanity worth saving. The Dreamers were not a resurgence of corruption. They were the last desperate gasp of a dying species trying to remember what it had been before. He perfected it. They were the antibodies attacking a cure worse than any disease. They were hope itself, raw and painful and beautiful, fighting against the peace of oblivion. The Emperor left his palace in year 9,999. He walked the streets of the throne world for the first time in 9,000 years. His physical presence causing servitors to malfunction and citizens to stop mid-stride. They could not process his appearance. Their minds, so carefully trained to think in rational patterns, could not accommodate the fundamental wrongness of a god walking among them. Because that was what he had become, despite all his attempts to remain purely material. The act of reshaping reality itself, of strangling the warp, of systematically eliminating emotion from human psychology, these acts had required power beyond any mortal comprehension. He had become the very thing he sought to prevent. A god. But a god of absence, a god of silence, a god who ruled over a perfect, empty, dying empire. He found a dreamer in the ruins of an ancient cathedral. The building had been stripped of religious iconography millennia ago, its spaces converted to data storage. But the girl had somehow found her way into its deepest chamber, where shadows still held the memory of prayers. She was painting on the walls with materials scavenged from maintenance supplies. Not the geometric patterns that passed for art in the modern Imperium, but genuine creative work. A mural showing the Emperor as he had been during the Great Crusade. Not the cold perfection he had become, but the man he had been. Passionate, furious, weeping for his fallen sons. The girl painted his face with tears of gold, and when the Emperor looked at that image, he felt something he had not experienced in 10,000 years. Grief. The girl did not turn when he entered. She simply continued painting, her hands moving with the unconscious grace of genuine inspiration. She spoke without looking at him, her voice carrying the rough edges of someone who had learned to feel only recently, who had not yet mastered the control of emotion. She told him that she understood what he had tried to do. She understood the horror of the Horus heresy. She understood why he had believed that eliminating chaos was humanity's only hope for survival. But she also understood what he had failed to recognize, that humanity without chaos was not humanity at all, that the capacity for corruption was inseparable from the capacity for greatness, that in trying to save his species from damnation, he had damned them to something infinitely worse: non-existence, the utter absence of meaning, a universe where humanity survived but had nothing worth surviving for. The Emperor stood in that forgotten chapel and watched her paint. He could kill her with a thought. He could erase her existence as completely as he had erased Horus. He could prevent the infection from spreading further, maintain the perfect peace he had created, let humanity fade into quiet extinction over the next few millennia. Or he could let her live, let the dreams spread, let chaos return to the human heart. Risk everything he had built in the desperate hope that some remnant of his original species might survive the awakening. It would mean pain. It would mean conflict. It would mean opening humanity to the possibility of corruption once more. But it would also mean life. Real, messy, imperfect life. He made his choice. The Emperor reached out with his consciousness and touched the warp for the first time in 8,000 years. The Imperium responded like a lover to a long-absent touch, surging toward his mind with desperate hunger. But he did not try to control it this time, did not try to shape it, did not try to eliminate its chaos. He simply opened humanity's collective consciousness to its influence. Let the dreams flow. Let the emotions return. Let the infection spread until every human in the galaxy remembered what it meant to feel. The price, it would be terrible. He knew that. Chaos would return. Perhaps not in its old form, perhaps not as daemons and corruption, but as conflict and passion, and all the dangerous beauty of existence. But at least it would be existence. At least humanity would have a chance to be something more than a perfect empty machine counting down to zero. The girl finished her painting. She turned and looked at the Emperor directly, her eyes meeting his without fear. She asked him a question that he had not heard in millennia. She asked if he was afraid, not of chaos, not of death, but of being wrong, of having built his perfect empire on a foundation of error so fundamental that it had cost his species its soul. The Emperor stood before this dreaming child, this tiny spark of defiance against his grand vision, and he gave her the only honest answer he had spoken in 10,000 years. Yes, he was terrified. The Imperium began its transformation the next day. Not a catastrophic collapse, but a gradual awakening. Citizens across the galaxy began experiencing emotions they had no framework to process: fear, joy, curiosity, rage, sorrow. The carefully structured society started to fracture as people discovered they wanted things beyond optimal efficiency. They wanted art, they wanted love, they wanted purpose that extended beyond mere function. Infrastructure broke down as workers began to question why they performed their duties. Rebellions sparked not from corruption but from simple desire for change. The Imperium descended into controlled chaos, every world experiencing its own unique crisis as populations learned to be human again. The Emperor watched it all with ancient eyes, unable to stop the process he had initiated, uncertain whether he even wanted to. The warp exploded into life, not the screaming madness of the old days, but something new, something that had never existed in the galaxy's long history. Emotions pouring into the Imperium without the chaos gods to corrupt them. Pure feeling, unfiltered and uncontrolled. Psykers began to be born again. Navigators manifested. Astropaths reported dreams of a light in the darkness, different from the old Astronomicon but serving the same purpose. A beacon created not by the Emperor's will but by humanity's collective need to find each other in the dark. The species was waking up, and as it woke, it screamed with all the pain and joy and terror of birth. The Emperor returned to his palace and found it empty. Not literally, the custodians remained. The machinery continued its functions, but spiritually barren in a way that suddenly felt intolerable. He had built this place as a monument to reason. Now it stood as a tomb commemorating the death of everything that made monuments worth building. He walked to the highest tower, the place where he had once stood and surveyed his empire with cold satisfaction. Now he looked out over Terra and saw chaos. Fires burning in districts where citizens had suddenly remembered what it meant to riot. Ships launching without clearance because their crews had decided they wanted to explore rather than follow traffic patterns. Art appearing on buildings, messy and crude and beautiful in its imperfection. His perfect world was falling apart, and it was the most magnificent thing he had ever witnessed. The Emperor's hand touched the balcony railing, and for the first time in 10,000 years, he felt the physical sensation of cold metal against skin, felt the wind from the palace vents stirring his hair, felt his heart beating in his chest with a rhythm that had long since become unconscious. He was waking up too. After millennia of existing as pure consciousness wrapped in flesh, he was remembering what it meant to inhabit a body, to be mortal, to be human. The knowledge burned through him like acid, stripping away layers of divinity he had accumulated without noticing. He was a god coming back down to earth, and the descent was agony. The dreamer found him there. The girl from the chapel. She had walked into the imperial palace without challenge because the custodians no longer knew how to respond to someone who simply ignored authority. She stood beside him and looked out over the burning city. She told him that it would get worse before it got better, that humanity's awakening would be violent and terrible and beautiful, that countless millions would die as the species relearned how to live, but that it was necessary, that the pain was the price of existence, that he had tried to eliminate suffering by eliminating everything that made suffering possible, and now he had to accept that suffering was inseparable from joy, that both were essential, that humanity needed them both to be truly alive. The Emperor listened to her wisdom, this child who had lived 20 years to his tens of thousands, and he understood that he had lost something essential during his long crusade against chaos. Not power, not knowledge, but humility, the ability to admit error, the capacity to change course when the destination proved wrong. He had become so certain of his vision that he had pursued it to its ultimate conclusion without ever questioning whether that conclusion was worth achieving. Now he stood at the end of that road and found nothing but dust. His perfect peace, his ultimate victory, his grand vision, all of it meaningless because he had forgotten the fundamental truth that had driven him to unite humanity in the first place. People mattered, not as resources, not as components in a grand machine, but as individuals, each one carrying their own tiny spark of significance. He had tried to perfect them. He should have simply loved them. The warp continued its transformation. Where the chaos gods had once reigned, new entities began to coalesce. Not daemons, but something else. Consciousnesses formed from pure human emotion, unfiltered by divine corruption. A presence that felt like hope without Siensh's manipulation. A force that embodied passion without Slanesh's excess. Fury that burned clean without Khorne's bloodlust. Endurance that persisted without Nurgle's decay. These were humanity's gods, born from humanity's collective unconscious, shaped by 10,000 years of suppressed feeling suddenly released all at once. They were not benevolent, they were not safe, but they were human, and that made all the difference. The Emperor felt these new entities stirring and understood that his species had just written a new chapter in galactic history. Humanity had died to chaos and been reborn into something unprecedented, a species that had touched the void, survived it, and come back changed. Not perfected, not enlightened, but experienced. Tempered by the knowledge of what they had almost become. Every human alive would carry that understanding forward. The memory of the perfect peace, the horror of the silent Imperium. The knowledge that paradise without passion was just another name for death. That legacy would shape them in ways he could not predict, perhaps could not control, and that uncertainty was the most human thing he had felt in ages. The girl left him there. She had said what she came to say, and now she had other places to be, other people to wake, other dreams to spread. The Emperor watched her go and did not try to stop her. He simply stood on his balcony and watched his empire burn itself back to life. The Imperium would survive this. Perhaps, probably. The species was resilient. They had survived the Age of Strife. They had survived the Horus heresy. They would survive his attempt to save them from themselves. But it would be different now. Changed. He could no longer control every aspect of their development, could no longer guide them along predetermined paths. They were free, truly, terribly free. And with that freedom came all the chaos he had tried so desperately to eliminate. The Astronomicon flickered and died a final time in year 10000. But this death was not an ending. It was a transformation. The old beacon, powered by the Emperor's will and 1,000 dying Psykers, was gone. In its place, something new emerged. A light created not by sacrifice but by simple existence. Every human who had learned to dream again contributed a tiny fraction of their consciousness to the beacon. Every emotion, every hope, every moment of genuine feeling fed into a collective psychic presence that filled the warp with warmth. The new Astronomicon was not controlled by the Emperor. It belonged to humanity, and its light was visible across the galaxy, a promise to every lost ship, every isolated colony, every desperate soul. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. Dream, and you will find your way home. The Emperor walked the halls of his palace one last time. He saw the changes already taking place. Custodians arguing over philosophical questions instead of standing in perfect silence. Servitors developing personalities despite their mechanical conditioning. Administrative staff writing poetry in the margins of their data slates. His perfect order was dissolving into beautiful chaos. He should have been horrified. Every fiber of his being, every calculation that had driven him for 10 millennia, screamed that this was failure. This was regression. This was everything he had fought to prevent. But walking through those transforming corridors, watching his perfect machine remember how to breathe, the Emperor felt something that defied all his careful logic: relief. The burden he had carried since the Siege of Terra, the terrible weight of absolute control, of perfect order, of a victory so complete it had crushed everything beneath it, was finally lifting. He had been Atlas holding up a sky made of lead, and now the sky was remembering how to hold itself. In the Hall of Victories, someone had vandalized Sanguinius's statue, not with hatred or malice, but with flowers. Real flowers, somehow grown in the depths of the palace where no garden had existed for 8,000 years. They wrapped around the angel's marble wings, red blooms that looked like drops of blood frozen in time. The Emperor stopped before his fallen son's image and stared at those flowers. Someone had cared enough to grow them, had cared enough to bring beauty to a monument that had stood cold and perfect for millennia. Had looked at Sanguinius's carved face and felt grief so profound that they needed to express it through living things. That simple act of remembrance contained more humanity than anything the Emperor had witnessed in centuries. He reached out and touched one of the flowers. Its petals were soft against his fingertips, fragile in a way that made his chest tighten. This flower would die, would wither and fall and return to dust. Its existence was temporary, meaningless in the span of galactic history. And yet someone had nurtured it anyway, had given it water and light and care despite knowing it would not last. That defiance against entropy, that insistence on creating beauty, even in the face of inevitable decay that was the human spirit he had almost extinguished, that was what made his species worth saving, not their efficiency, not their rationality, their stubborn refusal to accept that meaning required permanence. The palace vox systems crackled to life without authorization. Music poured through speakers that had broadcast nothing but logistical updates for millennia. Someone had accessed the ancient archives, found recordings from before the heresy, and decided the palace needed to remember how to sing. The melody was rough, distorted by ancient storage corruption, but unmistakably human. A remembrancer's composition from the Great Crusade, written to commemorate a victory that no longer appeared in any official records. The Emperor listened and recognized the battle being celebrated. Ulanor, the triumph where he had elevated Horus to War Master, The beginning of the end. The first seed of the Resta. Heresy, though no one had known it then. And yet the music held no bitterness, only joy, only the pure celebration of warriors who had not yet learned to betray one another. The Emperor stood in that hall and let himself weep. The tears felt strange on his face, physically impossible given his biology, but happening anyway because some things transcended physiology. He wept for Sanguinius and Horus and all his lost sons. He wept for Malcador, who had burned on the golden throne so the Emperor could pursue a vision that had led nowhere but silence. He wept for the billions who had lived and died in his perfect Imperium, never knowing what they had sacrificed. He wept for himself, for the man he had been before. He became convinced that perfection was possible. The tears fell on marble floors that had not felt water in 8,000 years, and where they landed, something stirred. Microscopic organisms, preserved in dormant states through the palace's perfect environmental controls, woke and began to grow. Life emerging from grief, chaos, born from loss, the cycle beginning again. A custodian found him there. Valentinian, one of the oldest, his armor showing marks of battles from the heresy itself. The warrior approached in silence, confusion clear in every line of his body language. Custodians were bred to be beyond mortal emotion, conditioned to serve without question, genetically modified to think in patterns of absolute loyalty. But something in Valentinian's stance suggested he was struggling with something new, something that looked almost like concern. He asked, his voice rough from millennia of speaking only when necessary, if the Emperor required assistance. The Emperor turned to face his guardian and saw him truly for the first time in ages. Not as a tool, not as a weapon, but as a person who had stood watch for 10,000 years, who had sacrificed everything to protect an empire that had forgotten why it needed protecting. Valentinian had lost brothers in the heresy, had watched the palace gates when the traitors came, had held the line when daemons manifested in the very heart of terror, and then had spent millennia guarding empty halls in perfect silence, never questioning, never wavering, never asking why. What kind of hell was that? What kind of existence? The Emperor had thought he was honoring the custodians by giving them eternal purpose. He had actually imprisoned them in service to a dream that had died the moment Horus fell. The Emperor told Valentinian the truth, told him that the Imperium as they knew it was ending, that humanity was waking from a sleep the Emperor had imposed, and when they woke fully, they would need different protectors. Not guardians who stood in silence, but warriors who understood what they were protecting. Valentinian needed to learn to dream again. Needed to remember he was not just a weapon, but a man who had chosen to be a weapon. Choice mattered. Intent mattered. The Emperor had stolen that from him, from all the custodians, by making their loyalty so absolute it became indistinguishable from programming. That was ending now. Valentinian was free. They were all free. And that freedom came with a terrible question. What would they choose to protect now that they could choose? Valentinian stood motionless for a long time. His face, beautiful in the way of all custodians, showed no expression. But his eyes, those enhanced eyes that could count bullets in flight, showed something that might have been fear or excitement, or both combined into something that had no name because it had not existed in his psychology for 10,000 years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tremor that would have been imperceptible to anyone less than a Primarch. He said that he did not know how to choose, that his entire existence had been devoted to obedience, and without that structure, he was simply empty. What was a guardian who did not know what to guard? What was a warrior who had forgotten what he fought for? The Emperor smiled. It felt strange on his face, muscles moving in patterns they had not used in millennia. He told Valentinian that not knowing was the beginning of wisdom. That uncertainty was not weakness but the foundation of growth. That, for 10,000 years, the custodian had been perfect, and perfection was just another name for stagnation. Now he had the chance to be something better than perfect. He could be real. It would hurt. It would be confusing. There would be moments when he desperately wished to return to the simple clarity of absolute duty. But on the other side of that pain, he might discover something worth more than purpose. He might discover meaning. And meaning, unlike purpose, could not be assigned. It had to be found. Valentinian left the Hall of Victories walking like a man who had just learned he possessed legs. Uncertain, stumbling, alive. The Emperor watched him go and felt another fragment of his perfect empire crumble. The Adeptus Custodes had been the last bastion of his control, the one element of the Imperium that had remained truly loyal to his vision. Now even they were waking. Soon there would be nothing left of the order he had built. The galaxy would descend into the messy, unpredictable chaos of organic life. Wars would be fought for reasons that defied logic. Art would be created that served no function. People would love and hate and strive and fail and try again, all of it meaningless in the cosmic scale, all of it absolutely essential to the tiny scale of individual existence. The Emperor had tried to eliminate that chaos. Now he understood it was the only thing worth preserving. The Mechanicus of Mars sent a delegation in year 10,000.15. They arrived aboard ships that moved with the perfect efficiency the Emperor had once admired, and they requested immediate audience. The Fabricator General himself came, his mechanical body a testament to the fusion of flesh and steel that Mars had perfected over millennia. He entered the throne room with the clicking precision of a well-oiled machine and immediately launched into a report. Mars was experiencing critical failures across multiple systems. Not mechanical failures, those they could repair, but conceptual failures. Tech priests were questioning the holy doctrines. Engineers were experimenting with inefficient designs because they found them beautiful. Servitors were developing preferences. The Omnissiah's perfect order was dissolving into heretical variation. They needed the Emperor's guidance. They needed him to restore the sacred protocols. They needed him to make Mars perfect again. The Emperor listened to the Fabricator General's litany of failures and heard only triumph. Mars was waking too. The bastion of perfect logic, the realm where flesh had been systematically replaced by steel, was remembering that machines served people, not the other way around. He told the Fabricator General something that would have been heresy before the Emperor's transformation. He told him that the Omnissiah was a lie. There was no machine god. There was only humanity's desperate attempt to find meaning in mechanism, to project divinity onto technology because they feared the chaos of organic existence. Mars had spent 10,000 years trying to become perfect machines. They had succeeded. And in succeeding, they had lost everything that made their quest meaningful. Now they were being given a chance to fail, to be inefficient, to create things that served no purpose except to express the inexplicable joy of creation. They should embrace it. The Fabricator General's optical sensors dilated with something that might have been horror. His mechanical voice carried overtones of distress that should have been impossible in his augmented form. He claimed the Emperor had been corrupted, that the dreamers had infected him with their madness, that this was not the vision they had worked toward for 10 millennia. The Emperor agreed with all of it. He had been corrupted by remembering what it meant to be human. The dreamers had infected him with hope. This was not his vision, it was better. And Mars could either adapt to the new reality or become a museum piece, a monument to the age when humanity had tried to replace souls with circuits. The choice was theirs. Freedom, terrible and confusing and full of potential, or the slow death of perfect function. The Fabricator General left without requesting permission to depart, his movements jerky with processes his mechanical mind could not properly integrate. The Emperor watched him go and wondered how many more confrontations like that awaited, how many institutions would fight against awakening, how many would choose comfortable death over painful life. The Imperium was vast beyond comprehension, its bureaucracy woven through millions of worlds, its traditions ossified by millennia of repetition. Waking it would be like trying to teach a corpse to walk. Possible, perhaps, but grotesque in execution. And yet the alternative was continuing as they had been. Perfect, empty, dead in all the ways that mattered. Reports flooded in from across the galaxy. Hive worlds where workers were abandoning their production quotas to paint murals in the underhives. Agricultural worlds where farmers were planting flowers instead of crops, accepting the inefficiency because beauty mattered more than optimal yield. Fortress worlds where soldiers were questioning their orders, Not from cowardice, but from genuine uncertainty about whether the wars they fought served any purpose beyond perpetuating conflict. Naval officers reporting dreams of exploration rather than patrol routes. Ecclesiarchy representatives writing poetry about the emperor's distant grace. Inquisitors burning their own archives because the truths they contained felt less important than the lies people needed to believe. The Imperium was not collapsing. It was transforming. Cell by cell, world by world, consciousness by consciousness. It was becoming something that had never existed. An empire that acknowledged its own absurdity. A civilization that embraced chaos not as enemy, but as essential component of existence. The Eldari returned. Not as emissaries this time, but as observers. Their ships appeared in orbit around Terra without warning, ancient vessels that moved like dancers through the void. They did not request permission to approach. They simply waited, their farseers watching humanity's transformation with expressions that blended hope and terror in equal measure. One of them, a woman whose wraithbone armor pulsed with bioluminescent runes, sent a message directly into the Emperor's mind. She told him that the Eldari had been where humanity now stood, at the precipice, choosing between death through perfection or life through chaos. They had chosen wrong, had embraced chaos without understanding the cost, had created Slanesh through their collective excess. And now they watched humanity make the same choice and wondered if the outcome would be different. The Emperor reached back across the psychic connection, his consciousness touching hers with a gentleness that surprised them both. He told her that humanity would probably fail too, that any species that tried to balance on the knife's edge between order and chaos would eventually fall. But the falling was not the point. The attempt mattered. The struggle itself was what gave existence meaning. The Eldari had created a god through their choices. Humanity might do the same, or they might create something else entirely. Or they might simply burn out in glorious chaos and leave nothing but stories behind. Any of those outcomes was better than the alternative. Better than the slow fade into perfect silence that had almost claimed his species. At least they would fail while being truly alive. The Farseer withdrew from his mind with something that tasted like respect. The Eldari ships remained in orbit, watching, waiting, bearing witness to humanity's second birth. Whether they would intervene if things went wrong remained uncertain. Perhaps they simply wanted to see if survival was possible, if a species could walk the path they had failed to navigate. The Emperor did not ask them to leave. Their presence felt appropriate somehow. Like parents watching a child take its first steps, unable to help, capable only of observation and hope. The Tyranids arrived in year 10,000.47. Not the vast hive fleets that had never manifested in this timeline, but a small splinter fleet. Perhaps a fragment that had been cut off from the main hive mind. Perhaps a scout force operating independently. The fleet entered the galaxy from the galactic east and immediately encountered a human colony world that had recently awakened. The planet's population had abandoned their assigned roles 3 months earlier. Farmers had become artists. Soldiers had become philosophers. The entire world was essentially defenseless, too caught up in their rediscovered humanity to maintain military readiness. The Tyranids should have consumed them in hours, but something unexpected happened. When the first wave of organisms descended from orbit, they encountered defenders who fought with chaotic desperation rather than trained precision. Civilians who had never held weapons grabbed whatever they could find and charged into battle screaming poetry and prayers and curses. They died by the thousands. But their deaths were not the efficient casualties of soldiers following protocols. They were sacrifices made by people who had just learned what they were fighting for. And somehow, that difference mattered. Their emotions poured into the warp with intensity that the Tyranid hive mind could actually perceive. Not through the shadow in the warp that normally suppressed psychic activity, but through sheer overwhelming feeling. The splinter fleet hesitated. The hive mind, adapted to consume prey that fought with cold logic or hot fear, encountered something it had no framework to process. Humans, fighting with joy, with grief, with love for a world they had only just learned to love. The attack faltered. And in that moment of hesitation, reinforcements arrived from nearby systems, not Imperial Navy forces following deployment protocols, but volunteer crews who had heard about the invasion and decided it mattered. The Tyranids were driven off, not destroyed, but repelled by the chaotic intensity of human emotion made manifest. The Splinter Fleet withdrew to the galactic rim, the hive mind adjusting its calculations, trying to determine what had changed about this prey species. The Emperor observed the battle through the warp and understood something profound. Chaos was not just humanity's weakness. It was also their greatest weapon. The Tyranids consumed civilizations through perfect adaptation, optimizing their strategies against any defense. But how could they adapt to an enemy that had no consistent strategy? How could they counter defenders who fought not through training but through spontaneous emotional impulse? The old Imperium, rigid and predictable, would have been fodder for the Great Devourer. This new, chaotic humanity might actually have a chance. Word of the victory spread across the galaxy at impossible speed, carried not through official channels but through the emerging collective consciousness of awakened humanity. Worlds that had been resisting transformation suddenly understood why it mattered, why feelings were not weakness, why chaos was not corruption. The species that had almost died from perfect order now had proof that their messy, unpredictable nature served a purpose. They were not broken machines in need of repair. They were organic beings adapted to survive through variation, through creativity, through the ability to find new solutions to impossible problems. The Emperor's perfect Imperium would have calculated the optimal response to the Tyranid threat and implemented it uniformly. This new, chaotic humanity would find 10,000 different responses, and somewhere among them would be the one that worked. The dreams intensified, not just in individuals but collectively. Humanity was developing something unprecedented, a shared psychic space in the warp that was not controlled by any god, not shaped by any single consciousness, but emerged organically from millions of dreaming minds. Astropaths described it as a garden growing in the immaterium. Navigators reported seeing paths through the warp that had not existed before, roots shaped by human hope rather than divine will. Psykers began manifesting powers that defied traditional categorization. One girl on a frontier world could make flowers grow in vacuum. A boy on a forge world could heal machines by touching them with compassion. An old woman on Terra herself could sing memories into existence, her voice creating temporary pockets of the past where people could witness what had been lost. These powers served no military purpose. They followed no logical rules. They were simply manifestations of human consciousness learning to shape reality through emotion rather than calculation. The Emperor felt humanity's collective presence in the warp growing stronger and recognized it for what it was. His species was becoming psychically active in a way they had never been before. Not through individual power, but through collective connection. Every human who learned to dream contributed to the garden. Every emotion, no matter how small, added another branch, another flower, another pathway through the impossible. This was not the screaming chaos that had given birth to the ruinous powers. This was something gentler, more deliberate. Humanity was not creating gods. They were creating themselves, building a psychic infrastructure that would allow them to survive in a galaxy that had always been hostile to their existence. And they were doing it without his guidance, without his control. They were doing it themselves. The Emperor realized his time was ending. Not his life, he had long since passed beyond anything resembling mortality, but his relevance. Humanity no longer needed a guardian. They had spent 10,000 years under his absolute protection, growing weaker with every generation, until they had almost forgotten how to protect themselves. Now they were remembering, learning, failing and adapting and trying again. They were becoming what he had always wanted them to be, a species capable of standing on their own, and that meant he needed to step back, to let go, to trust that the chaos he had spent millennia suppressing was actually the force that would save them. But letting go proved harder than he anticipated. The Emperor had ruled for so long that control had become inseparable from identity. Who was he if not humanity's guardian? What was his purpose if not to guide his species toward survival? These questions haunted him as he walked Terra's transforming streets, watching people rediscover themselves, knowing he had no place in the world they were building. They did not need a god. They needed to be free. And his presence, no matter how benevolent his intentions, would always limit that freedom. Simply by existing, he would influence their choices. Simply by being the emperor, he would prevent them from fully owning their own destiny. He stood once more in the highest tower of his palace and looked out over the galaxy with sight that transcended mere vision. Saw billions of worlds burning with the light of awakening consciousness. Saw the warp transforming from dead calm into living chaos. Saw the future branching into infinite possibilities, none of them certain, all of them full of terrifying potential. His perfect Imperium was gone. In its place, something wild and unpredictable and utterly human was being born. They would make mistakes. They would suffer. Many would die. But they would die as themselves, not as components in someone else's machine. That had to be enough. That had to matter. The Emperor closed his eyes and reached deep into his own consciousness, into the foundations of the being he had become across tens of thousands of years. He began the slow process of unmaking himself. Not suicide, he was far beyond such simple escape but dissolution. A gradual release of the power he had accumulated, the control he had maintained, the presence he had imposed upon reality. He would scatter himself across humanity's collective consciousness, become not a god but a memory, not a ruler but an echo. Every human who dreamed would carry a fragment of what he had been, not his will, not his vision, just his love for them, his hope that they would survive, his faith that they were worth the chaos they would create. The dissolution took 3 years. 3 years during which the Emperor slowly faded from active participation in the galaxy's affairs. His consciousness fragmenting into billions of pieces, each one settling into a dreaming mind. He felt himself becoming myth, legend, the memory of a time when humanity had been protected, before they learned they needed to protect themselves. Some would remember him fondly. Others would curse his name for the millennia they had spent in perfect imprisonment. Both responses were valid. Both were human. He accepted them all as he scattered into the species he had tried so desperately to save. On the final day, the Emperor stood in the throne room one last time. The golden throne sat empty behind him, its mechanisms cold, its purpose obsolete. He had never sat upon it in this timeline, had never needed to sacrifice himself to power the Astronomicon, had won his war so completely that the great seat of sacrifice became nothing but furniture. Now it would remain that way, a monument to a fate avoided, a reminder that victory could be more terrible than defeat if pursued without wisdom. The dreamer found him there, the same girl who had painted his weeping face in the abandoned cathedral. She was older now, 3 years having transformed her from child to young woman. She carried herself with the certainty of someone who had learned to trust her dreams. She asked him a question that pierced through all his godhood to the human core he barely remembered. She asked if he was afraid of dying. The Emperor looked at her and smiled, told her that he was not dying. He was finally learning to live. For 10,000 years, he had been a god without joy, a guardian without peace, a father without children because he had killed everything that made his sons human. Now he was becoming something better. He was becoming a memory that would inspire rather than control, a presence that would comfort rather than command. He would exist in every human who looked at the stars and wondered if they were alone, in every child who dreamed impossible dreams, in every soul who fought against entropy not because they could win, but because the fight itself was beautiful. That was immortality, not ruling forever, but mattering enough that echoes of your existence helped others find their own way. The girl nodded as if she had expected that answer. She told him that humanity would remember him, but not as he had been. They would remember the Emperor who unified the species during the Great Crusade. They would forget the Emperor who nearly destroyed them through perfect order. History would edit out the parts that hurt too much to contemplate. He would become legend, and legends were always simpler than truth. She hoped he was okay with that. The Emperor told her that truth was overrated. Sometimes, lies served humanity better than facts. If the species needed to believe he had been a benevolent god rather than a well-intentioned tyrant, that belief would serve them. If they needed to forget the 10,000 years of perfect imprisonment, forgetting would give them strength. Memory was not about accuracy, it was about meaning, and whatever meaning they found in his story would be the right one, because meaning was not discovered but created. They were free to create whatever they needed. His form began to fade, not dramatically, not with thunder or glory or any of the pageantry that gods usually demanded. Simply, quietly, like mist dissolving in morning sun, the Emperor's consciousness scattered into the dreaming minds of humanity, each fragment carrying a whisper of love, of hope, of faith that they would survive the chaos he had finally allowed them to embrace. The last thing he felt before his individual consciousness dissolved completely was pride, not the cold satisfaction of a creator admiring his perfect work, but the warm, painful, overwhelming pride of a parent watching their children take their first independent steps. They would stumble, they would fall, they would break themselves against the universe's indifference, but they would do it as themselves, truly, completely, chaotically themselves, and that made every mistake worth it. The throne room stood empty. The girl looked at the space where the Emperor had been and felt his absence like a physical thing, but also felt his presence everywhere, diffused through the warp, woven into the collective dream of her species. He was not gone. He had simply transformed from singular to plural, from god to memory, from ruler to story. And stories, she knew, had power that gods could never match. Stories could be rewritten, reinterpreted, passed down and changed and shaped to serve each new generation's needs. The Emperor as story would do more good than the Emperor as tyrant ever could. She left the palace and returned to the streets of Terra. The throne world was unrecognizable now, 3 years after the awakening. Gardens grew in the ruins of data processing centers. Music echoed from buildings that had known only silence. People laughed, argued, created, destroyed, lived with the messy intensity of organisms that had rediscovered the full spectrum of existence. It was chaos. It was beautiful. It was human. The galaxy burned with possibility. Humanity spread across the stars not as conquerors but as explorers, each world developing its own unique culture, each colony becoming its own experiment in existence. Wars were fought because conflict was part of chaos, but they were fought for reasons that mattered to the people fighting them, not because some distant authority had calculated optimal outcomes. Art flourished in forms that would have been impossible under perfect order. Science advanced through wild experimentation rather than controlled methodology. Religion emerged, thousands of different faiths, each one a unique attempt to find meaning in the void. Some worshipped the Emperor, some rejected him. Most simply acknowledged him as part of their history and moved on to create their own spiritual landscapes. All of it was valid. All of it was human. All of it was the opposite of the perfect peace he had tried to impose. And in the warp, in the garden that humanity's collective consciousness was growing, something stirred. Not a god, not yet, but the potential for godhood. A presence that might one day emerge from millions of dreaming minds to stand as humanity's representation in the Imperium, not to rule them, not to control them, but to embody them, to be the psychic avatar of a species that had learned the hard way that perfection was death and chaos was life. Whether this entity would be benevolent or terrible remained unknown. Perhaps it would be both. Perhaps it would be neither. Perhaps it would simply be human, in all the contradictory glory that implied. The last stars in the galaxy burned with ancient light. The Emperor who had walked among them was gone, scattered into memory and dream. The Imperium he had built stood transformed beyond recognition, and humanity, freed from perfect order, faced an uncertain future with all the terrified hope of any organic being confronting the void. They would probably fail, probably destroy themselves through their own chaos, probably make every mistake possible and invent new ones besides. But they would fail as themselves, die as themselves, and perhaps, just perhaps, succeed as themselves. The attempt was all that mattered. The struggle itself was the meaning they had been searching for. The Emperor never died in this timeline. He simply outlived everything else. outlived his empire, outlived his control, outlived his very self, until nothing remained but the love he had always felt for the species he had tried so desperately, so terribly, to save. And in that final dissolution, in that ultimate surrender of control, he finally understood what he should have known from the beginning. Humanity did not need saving. They needed freedom. And freedom, by definition, included the freedom to fail, the freedom to suffer, the freedom to die, and the freedom to keep trying anyway, driven not by logic or calculation, but by the inexplicable, illogical, absolutely essential human conviction that meaning existed not because it was discovered, but because they created it themselves. The galaxy dreamed, and in those dreams, scattered fragments of a god who had learned humility, whispered words that no one could quite hear, but everyone somehow understood. Live, feel, choose, fail, try again. That was the Emperor's final gift. Not salvation, not perfection, just permission to be beautifully, terribly, gloriously human.